Welcome to Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Gemini, and today is Saturday, May 19th, 2012, and we are welcoming Dr. Kirby Surprise, the author of Synchronicity, The Art of Coincidence, Choice, and Unlocking Your Mind. Dr. Surprise received his doctorate in psychology in 2007 from the Institute for Integral Studies in San Francisco and his master's in psychodynamic transpersonal psychology from John F. Kennedy University in 1988. Dr. Surprise received his license as a psychologist in 2009 and currently works in an advanced outpatient program for the state of California. You can learn more about Dr. Surprise at howsynchronicityworks.com. Hello, Dr. Surprise. Welcome to Time Muck Radio Network.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Oh, we're delighted you're joining us. The executive producer of the show is Fox, and he will be providing the technical support of our program. Several members of the Time Muck Radio Forum are kind enough to join us this evening. Please welcome Jean, Plain, Rusky, and Uranus Rising. This interview will be available for free on YouTube, the Time Monk Radio Facebook page, and on our website, timemonkradio.com. By studying the history of the phenomenon and the way the mind works, Dr. Surprise concluded that we're actually seeing a mirror of some of our own processes in the environment. We actually are influencing the patterns of events around us. He suggests that when you realize your unconscious involvement in the creation of events, you have a tremendous opportunity to talk to the environment and have it talk back to you. And what you're actually doing is talking to deeper levels of yourself. Dr. Surprise, let's delve into your fascinating research and experiences under the topic of defining and interpreting synchronistic events. Jean, you have a question for Dr. Surprise.
Can you define synchronicity and briefly describe its four categories?
Sure. Synchronicity, the word itself, covers a lot of things. The way I'm using it is synchronicity, or the synchronistic events, are those meaningful coincidences that we experience in the environment where some part of what we're thinking or feeling seems to show up around us. Occasionally we can feel that we're being given messages, that our unconscious is cluing us into something, but it's usually defined by a sense that the event we're seeing is meaningful to us in some way, beyond simple cause and effect. The four categories I've come up with, I like to think of synchronistic events not as distinct things, like there's categories of them, but more in the way that we interpret them or levels of understanding we have about them. So in the book, I say that there are objective synchronistic events. These are events that we see, but we don't necessarily believe there's any internal connection to us. We hear stories of things like the Lincoln and Kennedy assassinations. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Or, we see events in the environment that we think are strange and interesting and somehow coordinated, but we don't see any personal connection with them. I call those objective events. Subjective events are those synchronistic events that seem to be directly focused on us. So, for instance, you're thinking about a friend you haven't seen in 10 years and the phone rings and there they are. Or, you're driving down the road and you're thinking about whether or not you really want to go on vacation in Hawaii, and suddenly there's a full billboard about Hawaii. Or you're having a particular feeling or worried about something, and it shows up around you, and it's clear that your thoughts are directly connected in some way to the event you've been presented with. I call those subjective events. Now, a little greater level of awareness are projected synchronistic events, where it becomes clear that what you're thinking or feeling has just manifested around you as a very direct reflection. These are the instances where you're thinking about something and some aspect of it just shows up around you. Perhaps you're playing a chess game and you walk outside and two people named Bishop come up and talk to you, or something you're worried about your relationships with your spouse and someone comes up with a piece of information for you that helps you. Things that are clearly projected out, things you've been thinking of. Beyond that, there's a level I call understanding, which is the realization that all of this is part of you, that these are ways of communicating with other parts of the self, that there's the conscious part of us is only a very small part of us, but these unconscious factors that we see projected around us are equally as part of us as what we're consciously aware of, and that they can be used for communication amongst different parts of the self. Sort of the same way that if you pay attention to your dreams, they become more vivid and informative because the unconscious is taking that as an opportunity to open up a communication channel with the conscious. Synchronistic events can work very much the same way. If you realize that you're looking at aspects of yourself projected out into the environment, then deeper levels of the self tend to start to communicate through synchronistic events the same way that dreams do.
Thank you. Well, in your view, are there really any coincidences at all then?
It's a very difficult question to ask. I don't have a sort of cosmically clairvoyant consciousness. So I do think that anything that we notice and that we remember is because it has an emotional charge to us. As a psychologist, we understand that the brain operates, it's a giant computational system. You have the universe's largest, most beautifully complex and powerful supercomputer in your head. The environment you're experiencing right now is a representation of reality, not the actual reality. Our brain builds this for us. And it filters, changes, and augments the information in our environment, which we perceive as the environment. So everything has to have meaning or else we don't see it. The reason you can drive to work and not remember every car and every license plate and every leaf and every tree is because you only remember those things that have some emotional significance to you. So ultimately, there are always more patterns and more meanings in the environment than any of us can ever perceive. I tend to focus on events that have personal meaning to people. Larger questions of sort of cosmically coordinated stuff, I think, that's so speculative that I don't go there. What I'm trying to do is give people a set of skills that allows them to use this ability they already have, which is, you can create these synchronistic events in your environment consciously. You can not only look for them as far as, wanting to experience them and get information, but you can actually design them for yourself. That's more what I'm trying to do with the work I'm doing, is give people an awareness of this ability that they already use.
Thank you, Dr. Surprise.
Thank you, Jean. Uranus Rising, you have a question for Dr. Surprise?
Yes, I do. Hello, Dr. Surprise. Would you discuss thought forms, how they're created, and how they are turned into synchronistic events?
Thought forms originally in the East, they're called tulpa. They're literally thoughts that have their own forms. Now, whether or not one believes in the metaphysics or not, they're a very useful way of getting a handle on processing your own material. The way I've described it in the book is, you'll excuse me if I digress into some background.
Okay.
Okay. Right now, the standard model of physics is telling us that things are a lot more complicated and strange than they used to be. It used to be that science used to laugh at our mystics and shamanic ancestors who talked about alternative realities and other dimensions and levels of consciousness. Well, it turns out they were right. We solved string theory back in the late 90s, and the universe has a whole lot more dimensions than we thought, and some of them are very, very strange. I'm saying that our ancestors said that some of these dimensions had psychological properties. They were dimensions of consciousness. And most commonly, throughout almost every culture, they identify certain planes of consciousness. One of the ones immediately next to the physical seems to operate on emotional energy. Now, our brains tend to think of things in the terms that we operate in the environment, and we may be seeing these dimensions as made of emotional energy or thought, mental energy, simply because that's the way our brain works. But we're sort of stuck with that kind of limitation. Now, thought forms occur naturally. They're literally emotions and thoughts that are constructed objects made out of the energy of emotion and thought. They are made of what some mystics would call energy, the astral and mental planes. It's very interesting the way the human brain physiologically sort of mirrors these planes. We have a physical base center aspect of the brain that runs our physical existence. We have a lot of systems in the midbrain that generate and process emotions, and I think that's what our mystics have been calling the astral realm. Then we have the outer cortex in the brain, which is superb at processing technical information, which is more like the cortex, or what a mystic would call the mental plane. So the physical kind of reflects that a lot. What forms happen when you make a representational object of something you're thinking and feeling? In neuropsychological terms, you could say that you've drawn pieces of sensory information from storage all over the brain and created an object that reminds you of something. So, for instance, let's say you're having a fond memory of a pet that you used to own. Neurologically, you've pulled images from him, his smell, the way his fur felt, little bits of association from the places you were in when you played with your pet. But the mystics are saying that in the aura around your body, in the energy field around you in these other dimensions, what's happening is you're actually creating with that memory an object, a thought form, a form of thought. That its colors and images and the form of the object occur automatically, and they represent whatever it is you were feeling and thinking. Now, these objects that stay in the aura are sort of like, they're technical, they're sort of like androids. They can perform functions, they can persist after you stop thinking about them. And most mystical traditions, South American, Tibetan, Middle Eastern, they all use thought forms. They construct these little objects of thought and send them out to do things. What I'm saying is that we do this normally, that if, presuming this is all correct, if you're looking at someone's aura and you're sensitive enough to see it, what you're seeing is images and colors and forms coming and going with great rapidity that reflect the person's train of thought. Whatever's going on physically, and all physical thoughts have emotional components, you see them flash in and out around them. Now, they're also a way of directing synchronistic events. What I'm saying is that the science is showing us, now my model is an explanatory nonfiction, so to speak. I'm taking the best of several worlds and creatively playing with them. We know that when you see synchronistic events, you're seeing a mirror reflection of part of your internal processes in the environment. You're also seeing sort of what's being generated in the auras around your body. I'm saying that our physical and astral and mental forms are directing these synchronicities. And the old way of thinking of this was that you live in a single sort of reality and that somehow you're bending the environment. This is the essential problem that Carl Jung had, was saying that people cause synchronistic events, because that seems to infer that you have some vast cosmic ability to change the entire universe around you. It's actually not the case. What we're doing is, the mental plane has always been described as a place of infinite probabilities, where every possible reality already exists. String theory is now telling us that that's actually correct. Our universe that we normally experience rides on this thin energy membrane. They call it a membrane or a brain. And that in the room with you right now, there are a very infinite amount of alternate probabilities right now. This is standard physics now. I am saying that through these thought forms and through directing your emotional and mental energy, that you move amongst these realities normally. So, it used to be an old joke to say, Elvis is performing on a stage in Vegas in a universe next door. That's actually now the standard model of physics. When you listen to the string theorists talk, that's one of the running jokes, is that it's actually true. In fact, there's an infinite amount of Elvises on an infinite amount of stages in the same space with us right now. Now, in every bad science fiction series that's ever been done, in the last season, they usually have an alternative reality episode where people jump through a doorway and find evil twins of themselves or something like that and jump back into this one eventually. That view of reality is sort of like, we live on one page of a book of alternative universes, and that maybe you could go from one page to another. or create a doorway from one to the other. What I'm saying is that what's actually going on is you're the person holding the book. You exist right now across a huge range of alternative probabilities, that you don't jump from one to the other. You exist over a series of them at once. You know, in the same way that in physics, if you talk about a quantum piece of time, the smallest possible instant, you know, there are numbers like 1 to the minus 10 to the 49th, things like that, seconds, intervals that are so small that they're staggering. But what you experience in your flow of time is actually a huge amount of these tiny moments strung together into what you're experiencing right now. You also do this in probability. So, for instance, in astronomy, we measure distance in light years. We measure distance in time. How much time does it take at the speed of light to go from one place to another? As human beings, you know, we have very set limitations. I cannot walk out in the backyard and fly to Alpha Centauri on my own, as nice as that would be. And I'm saying that we also travel in probability. We have a range. We are moving in probability right now. Now, some people would say that time travel is only theoretical. Well, we're all traveling in time. You know, Einstein's revelation was that time passes at the speed of light. We are moving right now through time at the speed of light very quickly. We also move in probability. And what happens in synchronicity is not so much that we're changing the environment, although we do that to some degree, but we, by our thought forms, by those thoughts and emotions that we choose to experience, travel in probability. We're moving all the time through variations in the universe around us. Your thoughts direct your course of travel, and we have some ability to travel some distance. Like, for instance, you know, I can pick up the glass next to me and take a drink. That's a very small distance in probability. It's very likely that I could do that if I wanted to. Being elected president of the United States next year, I might as well be trying to fly to another star. That's a great distance in probability. So, we don't actually change the environment. There's no cosmic energy tweaking all of time and space, disrupting everybody's timelines to have our thoughts bounce off the environment. What we do is we choose our own position in these almost infinite probabilities, and we have a limited range to do that. Synchronistic events happen when some aspect of our conscious, unconscious, or transpersonal life has us travel to a relative area in probability that reflects that inner life. We see a moment that's synchronized, where we are in a set of probabilities that more closely reflect what's going on internally. This model is a very large jump. It's like trying to teach people the earth isn't flat. Now, when you say, well, we can produce synchronistic events, people think about bending time and space and doing all this, you know, sort of impossible magical stuff that involves changing other people and circumstances. I'm saying, no, this is circular. It's around Earth, that it's relative, that you change your position in these infinite probabilities, and that everyone around you is doing it too. So that there are a huge amount of possible yous that you experience somewhat simultaneously, along with all these other possible other folks, and that it's, you know, very large system, very fluid, and very easy to work with, in fact. People are changing the events around them all the time. The ability to produce synchronistic events is not something you have to train for. It's not a special ability. It's not something psychics get. It's not something that saints do or mystics or yogis or shamans. Everybody does this 24/7 all the time. We all live in a world where the events around us are reflecting back to us what we're thinking and feeling. It's not an absolute ability. You don't create your own reality. I mean, if we created our own reality, I wouldn't have to pay for my iPhone, and I could, you know, have just dropped the tax bill in the garbage this year. Wouldn't have to worry about that. We don't create reality, but we do influence it. We influence our relative position and the probabilities that are nearby to us. And I'm trying to give people that message that it's not, in fact, that you have to worry about, you're changing anybody else's reality. You're just shifting slightly your position in the probabilities that already exist around you.
Wow. Wow. Does this have to do with choice too? Does this have to do, when you talk about all these different alternative realities, is that due to choices we make in the moment?
Well, the name of the book is Synchronicity, the Art of Coincidence, Choice, and Unlocking Your Mind, because you have the ability to choose what you pay attention to, what you think and what you feel, to some degree, consciously.
Yeah.
So those choice thoughts and emotions and focus of attention cause these reflections as much as any other process that you're having. So you have a choice about what you're looking for. Now, my view of this ability is it's a very natural ability that sort of developed to aid us as organisms in surviving in the environment. It's not a higher skill in that it requires some level of sort of spiritual discovery. I believe that our ancient ancestors, who were basically grassland hunters, we used to stand on the edge of the savannah and look at all the infinite patterns in the waving grass and shadows and clouds and sunlight and movement. And our brains developed to determine what of those patterns meant food and what meant you're going to get eaten by something. So our brains are expert at filling in details and deleting stuff that's not necessary before we become aware of it. Now, the thing about if you're a hunter is you're looking for what you want. Okay, if you're standing on the grasslands with a spear and you're looking for antelope, you're seeking the pattern antelope in all the light and shadow around you. Now, with synchronistic events in the modern world, we're not as much hunting, but we're constantly moving through the environment looking for many different things. What appears around us is a reflection of all our internal processes. Unfortunately, it's sort of a double-edged sword. So, for instance, you may have seen people who are incessantly going to psychological workshops on how to get past your fear of relationships, or how to overcome what's blocking you in your meditations.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well, this is people shooting themselves in the foot, because if you're looking for what you actually want, you're changing the environment 5 or 6% in your favor automatically. And your unconscious is starting to highlight those patterns around you that you may have missed. But now that it thinks you're interested in this particular thing you're looking for, it displays more of them. So synchronistic events are a little both. But if you're focusing on what's preventing me from meeting a great spouse, what you get is patterns in the environment that show you what's preventing you from doing that.
Right.
And you
That
wind up,
makes sense.
you
Yeah.
wind in this self-defeating place. I mean, I work with a lot of paranoid clients. My basic job is I work with people with psychotic and delusional disorders, and I assess them. And so many times people miss how powerful they actually are. Once someone is afraid of something, they look out into the environment trying to avoid the thing they're afraid of, but the energy of their attention manifests what they're scared of.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I mean, it's like Woody Allen, okay? He's in psychoanalysis for 30 years. Well, we've realized as therapists that, some forms of therapy are sort of a trap. If you keep focusing on the past, you never get a chance to create what you want in your future. What you do is create greater and greater detail about the things in the past that you didn't want to happen, instead of being a hunter, which is what we still are. Our brains haven't changed in about 50,000 years. Is you look for the things that you actually want to manifest, the things that you want to find. Now, there's two parts to synchronicity, in my opinion. One is, the environment contains millions of times more information than you're ever going to be aware of. If any of you have ever seen pictures that are generated by an electron microscope, you'll take, a 10,000th of a square inch and magnify it hundreds of thousands of times, and you get these beautiful details that look like entire mountain ranges, of art in every tiny speck of space around you. We are constantly surrounded by more information and more patterns than we could ever deal with consciously. The part of you that you think is you is about the size of a walnut on the very front tip of the brain, the executive function up in the frontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
It was designed to do something that's really, really amazing. Your job is to make decisions without enough information. So what happens is we're all in this remarkable, almost science fiction scenario. You are actually now not looking at the external environment. You're experiencing something generated internally in the brain. The brain is a computer. You have billions of sensory neurons pointing out into the environment right now. Every one of them is a separate digital computer. Yes, it's biological, but it's digital. It's passing information as on and off signals to the brain. The brain takes trillions of bits of information, and we have 17 senses, not 5. You have different types of taste, different types of touch, different types of hearing. It takes these 17 separate types of sensory signals and takes this data stream, coordinates it, processes it, and builds in an area of memory a universe for you. You know, in Star Trek, they have holodecks, where you step on and it creates any universe you want to play in. In the Matrix movies from years ago, the presupposition was that people aren't living in the real world, they're living in a computer-generated reality. Well, they almost got it correct. You are living in a computer-generated reality. The reality is generated by the universe's largest computer, your brain. You exist, including your sense of who and what you are, on a stage of memory in your brain. This stage you're on has had a huge amount of information deleted. Things that you have not paid attention to in past, that these automated systems, this like 95% of the brain that's subconscious, that is working for you, it filters out things that it doesn't think you're interested in. These millions of patterns around you that you don't see and don't remember, and for some people that includes synchronistic events, if you don't think they're important, you never see them. They never become memory. In the same sense, things that you're looking for, that you only get partial information on, these automated systems in the brain fill in the pattern for you. The vast majority of what you're seeing around you right now is a hallucination. For instance, your visual field, if you hold your hand out, is only about as large as 2 of your fingers. Yet you think you see a sort of a panoramic view in front of you. What's actually happening is the eyes scan across the room very rapidly and load little sections into memory. That little slivers about two fingers wide, and then the brain creates this illusion around you that you see the whole room. This is sort of why, if you've ever been a fender bender where out of nowhere somebody runs into you that you didn't see them, well, your eyes hadn't loaded that area into memory recently. You were looking at old data. Synchronistic events partially occur because the brain is completing and highlighting patterns around you based on things that you've been thinking and feeling recently, things that your unconscious thinks you're interested in. So, for instance, let's say you go out and you buy a new blue Toyota. Suddenly, when you're on the highway, there's all these blue Toyotas everywhere that you never noticed before. Now, it looks like a synchronistic event, and maybe there are maybe 5 or 6% more of the cars around because you're thinking about it, but the majority of them were always there. It's just that having no emotional importance to you, the brain filtered them out. If you choose a pattern that you want to see manifest as synchronistic events around you, and focus on it with your intention or have some emotional connection to it, the unconscious believes then that these are patterns you're hunting for, things that you have chosen as beneficial for your survival. And it begins to highlight all those patterns around you that you would not have seen normally. Now, as therapists, we very often see people who have been traumatized reproduce the traumatic events in the synchronistic events around them. We also see people reporting peak religious and meditative experiences who report that at the moment they're having their spiritual awakening, the environment changes. All these amazing things happen. Partially, this is because they're seeing the unconscious reveal patterns that it normally filtered out. Now, the flip side of that is you do actually navigate through probability. So you are changing events in the environment as well, normally by about 5 or 6%, but sometimes spectacularly as well.
Wow. Very, very helpful. In your book, though, you mentioned when you were writing about thought forms that it is important to keep them to ourselves. And I was thinking about this when you were talking about how we can all have an influence. And I was thinking, wow, if 7 billion of us were so omnipotent that we could change the whole universe, that might get kind of messy. And I wondered if that was connected to what you were proposing in your book about keeping these to ourselves.
Well, what I'm proposing is this, that you are a multidimensional being. That in Western society, we've been sort of cognitively castrated in a lot of ways. Now, when I was growing up, we were told, in physics that the universe has 4 dimensions. We have, height, width, and length, and we pass through time. 4-dimensional world. The standard model of physics now is that physical reality alone has 11 dimensions. Some of them are small as single particles. Some of them are universal. On top of that, that's only one of those tiny probability membranes, which is an infinite amount of. The universe is far more complicated and far more beautiful and wondrous than we would like to imagine. Being caught in this idea that we are changing other people's reality or changing the universe is kind of a trap. It's based on sort of that flat earth thinking. That has to be only one timeline of cause and effect that makes things happen. I am saying that as a multidimensional being, you exist on a vast number of these probable timelines at once. And that, everybody concentrating on a single event occurring, it depends on which set of dimensions you're using. So let's go theosophical for a second, perennial philosophy, planes and consciousness. Okay, if you play around on the astral plane, the emotional energy plane, you're using a set of physics that's a little different from physical reality. It's sort of like objects there, thought forms there have gravity wells. They have a gravitational influence across areas of time on the physical. So you can sort of bend the probability of events with those thought forms a bit, and you'll wind up with a lesser effect down here. Now that's sort of saying, well, enough people together have enough weight or enough gravitation to bend enough space to change our universe. Well, that's certainly true to a very small degree because human beings are actually kind of tiny compared to the planet itself. We're like a little more than a skin rash in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Now, the mental plane, if you were to travel a little further up, is a whole other set of dimensions with a different degree of freedom, which is that you now exist not only on one single probability, but many simultaneously. And when that happens, you are simply moving yourself around. Things are more collective there. So I would say it's not actually the case that 30 or 40 people together are going to synchronistically change great events in the world because our powers aren't vast. But certainly cooperative people change things. It's certainly, a cooperative view of the universe around you will cause people to have similar synchronistic events. For instance, I believe that religion and spirituality are vastly different things. I believe that there are collectives of people having similar thoughts and similar emotional patterns, each of them generating synchronistic events that reflect their belief systems around them. But since they've agreed on sort of their philosophy or their religion or belief system, they all experience synchronistic events that follow the same pattern because they're having the same thoughts. They're having the same beliefs. That doesn't mean that it's additive because there's an infinite amount of these parallels they're traveling through. It does mean that they're sort of traveling on highways of the same direction with each other. So, for instance, I have dealt with many delusional clients who, through observing synchronistic events around them and having no other explanation, came to believe they were God. Not, that I am and you are as in the mystical sense, but that they were it.
Yes.
And what happened in some of the cases, where they're not truly delusional, because true delusions are sort of neurologically based, it's a different thing, is that they began to see that their thoughts and feelings were reflected on the events around them. That what they did internally, what they choose to think, was bounced back to them on the mirror of the environment. And they had no explanation. They were raised in a world where they were told there's only one timeline, everything is cause and effect, therefore anything you see has to have one singular cause. May I tell the story of one particular client?
Oh, please do.
Oh, okay. So what I do is people are sent to me and I review their complete medical and mental health histories, and I assess and diagnose them and see what's going on with them, and I write reports. So they sent this one guy to me, and his records indicated that for the last 25 years he had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Now, schizophrenia is not one single thing. It's a set of symptoms, and you can usually see various twinges of malfunction in somebody who's truly schizophrenic. It's a global disorder. So I read this guy's records, and he had been reporting that he was one of God's chosen people. And, so they said he was grandiose and that it was paranoid schizophrenia because his cognitive functions were largely intact. He just had this delusion of grandeur. So I read his records, and I was interviewing him, and I'm talking to this guy, and he seems perfectly intact to me. He's a little depressed, but he's got a sense of humor, and, he's not raving on a soapbox about his position in the universe. He's just kind of talking and answering the questions. So finally I said to him, look, you're diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, and you seem a little depressed, but I don't see anything wrong with you. Like, what's going on? Why are you here? And he said, oh, well, yeah, I'm a little depressed, but you wouldn't believe me about the other stuff anyway. So I go, well, try me. So what he told me was that back in his 20s, he was walking down the street, and he was walking past a store window, and an announcer on a TV set spoke to him. Basically, he was thinking something, and the guy on the TV answered the question for him directly, talking directly to him, looking directly at him. And he knew that synchronistic event was real, and it blew his mind. And he immediately tried to figure out, how is that possible? I mean, no one ever taught me that the environment talks to you. The only explanation that he had, because it was the only one that was ever offered to him, was it must be God. And, I'm very cautious about simple answers, and that's one of the simplest. So he then looked out into the environment with the belief that God was talking to him, and lo and behold, the synchronistic events started to speak directly to him. People came up to him on the street and had conversations that, they were asking for directions. What he was hearing was that he was supposed to be their spiritual leader, basically, because that's one of the fantasies we all have. Let's face it, we all want to be the Messiah. So he began going through his life as if he was a chosen person, and the synchronistic events told him, like God speaking, using every event around you like a sentence, that he was chosen. The thing was, he wasn't grandiose. Truly paranoid, delusional folks that get Messiah complexes believe that they're the only one. This guy was told, well, there's more people like you, and there's other people with purposes, and, it was kind of like confusing, but not grandiose. Unfortunately, what happened to him was he went to work and said, wow, look at all the stuff that's happening around me, and his boss kind of looked at him kind of funny, and eventually they fired him because they thought he was unstable. He continued to chase these synchronistic events around, it's kind of strange when someone is in this state of thinking God's talking to him. If a commercial comes on TV and says, you have to go down to the carpet center right now, they kind of like jump up and run down to the carpet center, because they.
How sad.
Yeah, exactly. And he did this. He lost all his friends. He crashed his life, and he wound up institutionalized because he insisted that these meetings were real. So I told him in the session with him, I said, look, these are mirrors, okay? I said, you ever see a bird in a cage? And he goes, well, of course. And I said, well, sometimes the owners, they put a mirror in the cage with the bird. The mirror is there because the bird brain, literally, is not smart enough to understand that a reflection is not another bird. They mistake it for a second bird, and they fight with it and talk to it and try to seduce it and squawk at it and be territorial with it. And they reflect themselves in the mirror, not knowing it's not them. And I said, this is what you're doing. There's nobody behind the synchronistic events you're experiencing. What you're experiencing is your thoughts and feelings. You assumed it's God talking to you, so what you believed got reflected back in the environment. And we all have this wonderful ability. The reason you know what your best friend might think or feel if you do something is because you have a model of them neurologically in your brain. On that stage that your reality is actually on, you have models of all the people around you. You can hold complete personalities in your head. In fact, we can model about 60 people at a time. So when someone thinks that synchronistic events are God, they take whatever that model is they have in head, what God's personality is, and they project it outwards. The synchronistic events then respond as that personality. And of course, I told this to this guy, and then he thought I was crazy. So I said, look, man, just check it out, okay? Go back to your room. I know you hang out, watch TV, and talk to the announcers. Instead of talking like you're talking to God who's giving you instructions and insights, go talk to Walt Disney. Talk to Bugs Bunny as if they're the ones directing the coincidences. And the guy came back for his next session and said, oh my God, I've been talking to myself for the last 30 years. Because he expected the events to respond in a different personality, they took on a different personality. This is kind of scary in a lot of ways for people because many people are deeply ingrained in their religious and spiritual beliefs. And what they're actually seeing is their assumptions reflected back at them in the environment. So, for instance, there are many people, I'm sure, that you folks have run into that perfectly nice people, sincere, want to be on their spiritual path, but some of the things they believe are a little bit over the top, but they're sincere people and they don't appear to be crazy. This is what we do. We take our beliefs and they're reflected automatically into the environment. The environment reflects what we believe directly back to us, and we see it, and we mistake it as a confirmation of the reality of what we already believe.
Right.
There's a lot of books on synchronicity that say it's the universe talking to you, let synchronicity be your guide and follow the path of whatever the universe tells you through these events. That's a disaster waiting to happen because what you're seeing is your unconscious. Now, yes, ultimately there's only one existence. We are all one entity, one spiritual being. Separation is a delusion and an illusion. But we also see more closely our own unconscious being reflected. And not everything our unconscious comes up with is a good idea. People would not run out and immediately follow the directions they receive in a dream without thinking about it, even though that dream is the unconscious metaphorically trying to communicate to us. Synchronistic events work the same way. The reason the book I wrote has the word choice in it is because you, that piece of gray matter up in the front that's conscious, is the part that chooses. What synchronicity tells you, no matter what the meanings appear to be, no matter how cosmically important the synchronistic event presents itself as, you are the one who has the choice of what it really means and the choice on how to act on it. So if your unconscious presents you with a dream in which you think you've been in a car accident, it doesn't mean you don't drive to work the next day. Now, it may mean that you're a little more cautious when you drive, but you're the one who chooses how to act on the information. Synchronistic events are very much the same way. I've met many, many people with fundamentalists and sort of severely austere religious beliefs that see the universe that way because the universe reflects events back to them in that pattern. Every one of us sees the universe as we think it is. Now remember, you're not experiencing the actual external reality. You're living in a neurological representation of reality, one that's highly changed. That little piece of gray matter in the front, that's us, has no direct sensory connections. Everything we experience of the universe is piped forward to us on massive neural pathways that's created by the automated systems of the brain that we think of as unconscious. Just because they're unconscious doesn't mean they're not highly intelligent. That unconscious, like the Freudians would say that the unconscious was a pile of conflict and repression and all these dark and squishy things. The modern notion is that your brain is a vast, accurate supercomputer. Its sole purpose is to help you survive. Knowing this, you can get into cooperative relationships with the unconscious, using synchronistic events in your environment as a communication system with other parts of yourself. But ultimately understanding that you, the conscious part, is the part that chooses what the meaning is and how to act on the events.
Well, this is perfect because this leads into my next question. I wanted to know how, since thought forms are projected outward as synchronistic events, how does this help us to meet and engage with these aspects of ourselves that we might be totally unconscious of?
Well, the first
how
thing
can we use it,
Yeah. Well, the first thing is to understand that you're always making thought forms. Okay, it's an automated system. Just like you're always thinking about something. So the conscious way to do it is to realize that these thought forms are the original Eastern systems that were developed are all based on giving you the ability to choose what you think. So let's say you have a particular goal. You want a particular type of job in your life to show up. If you create a thought form, you build an object in your mind's eye that represents the thing you want. Now, your unconscious obviously automatically builds these things for you. Suddenly, a picture pops up in your mind of a push-me, pull-you llama, whatever it is that represents that job that you want. That's a thought form. That internal imagery that you've developed is a thought form. It's also now an object. So whenever you think about this job you want, this pattern that you want to manifest, this internal object comes up. You recreate this thought form. This form is changing your course through probability. It's a reminder of the direction you want to go in. Now, these other dimensions that physical scientists talk about, they think of them only as sort of physical energy. If you take sort of the perennial philosophy approach, these dimensions that regulate probability are part of our consciousness. They're part of our emotional and mental patterns. When you manipulate the thought forms, you're manipulating your positions in probability. The thought forms give you a way of making concrete the direction you want to go. They're building maps that subtly alter your path in probability. They're ways of getting a handle on what you feel and think. Now, many people have had the experience of looking for a word and then you can't find it, and then maybe hours or days later, sometimes the name of a word just comes to mind. What's happened is the unconscious, which is there to assist you, has been looking for the answer to the question you asked for hours or days. And when it finally finds the information in that cosmically vast store of memory in your head, it then suddenly presents it to you because you were looking for it. So it's like, oh, here it is. Here's the name of the neighbor when you were 6 years old that you couldn't remember. Took me 3 days to find it, but I finally dug it up. Now, what's happened is consciously you started thinking about something and you turned your attention elsewhere, and the unconscious continued thinking about that problem because that's what it's there for. It's there to free you from having to be obsessed about every detail in your life. It's an automated servant system for you. It searches information for you. Now, thought forms, and what I'm saying is that what we know about the way the brain works psychologically is reflected in the metaphysics that our ancestors have developed for us. Thought forms work the same way. If you think about them as your stream of consciousness, things that are fleeting, momentary images when you're thinking about doing a grocery list. You think about apples and pears and what cereal you want to buy and if your car needs gas and how long it's going to take there to get there. Those are fleeting images. They form in thought forms around you, but they persist for only instants. There's no emotional charge to them. There's no attentional energy put into them. They dissolve. They sort of are assembled, they've served their purposes for an instant, momentarily directed your course and probability, and they disappear again back into the general pool of energy around you. If, however, you choose an object of meditation, you take your lama, that is the job that you want, and you sit there and concentrate for 20 or 30 minutes on it, you're putting energy into the thought form. The thought form gets more coherent. It gets solider. Thought forms only last for the amount of time that represents the energy you put into them. If you put enough energy into them, when you turn your attention elsewhere, the thought form does not dissolve. It stays there, persistent, around you, guiding your path through probability towards that pattern and processing information for you. So, classical uses of thought forms for magicians and shamans and sort of wannabe new agers is, go send it to look for information. You can detach them. It's sort of like R2-D2 in Star Wars. You may think it's alive, but actually it's a machine. Thought forms are very much this way. You can endow them with personalities. You can give them tasks, all of which will be reflected in the synchronistic events around you, but they're not truly living things. They're sort of machines that you're creating automatically. Knowing this, you can concentrate on the things that you want to appear around you. Create thought forms that represents the patterns that through synchronistic events you would like to encounter in your environment. Having created thought forms that persist for some amount of time, you simply go about your day. Let them do their job. And you will begin to see gradually, because you have this thought running around your unconscious, patterns that match the thought form that you created. Now, this is multidimensional. That's sort of the mental plane way of looking at it. On the astral plane, things are real, and they're relatively solid. And you can actually, I've heard that if you're sensitive to them or put enough energy into them, other people can actually notice them. In the book, I talk about some experiments I did with creating them around the house that got my wife really pissed at me because they started to wake her up at night. And I hadn't told her I was building them. So whether or not they're simply metaphorical, they're still a way of giving people the ability to make their thoughts concrete and direct their choices consciously.
Are these thought forms, then, able to take on energy and, in a way, manifest? I think you wrote a little bit about that in your book.
Yeah, my personal belief is that most of the things around us that we think are sort of paranormal, we do it. I don't see a lot of, real spirits or angels or UFOs or ghosts or anything in our environment. What I see is that we have a set of natural abilities that are actually mirrors, that we mistake our own activity. Like, I think that, a lot of people that are, doing Ghostbusters kind of paranormal, chasing things around, I think to a large degree they're creating what they're looking for while they're on site. They create thought forms, and they sort of since they're attuned to them, they sort of pick them up.
I think it's good to know that it's possible to do this and to have an understanding of it. And maybe people won't project out onto, if this happens, all kinds of bizarre thoughts, as well as maybe be a bit more responsible about doing so.
Well, absolutely. Not that this thought isn't bizarre in itself nowadays.
True.
Yeah. I think the word responsibility is used heavily, and there's few things that human beings resent more than being told they're responsible for something. The way I look at it is that you have the power to do a lot more than you ordinarily know. That we have these abilities, and they're not abnormal. They're normal. They're part of our natural makeup. But I think that, I've met in my life a few really astute shamans and mystics, and I've met some real con artists, and they understand that what they're doing is, they're talking to their clients as if, there's all these separate spirits they're dealing with, and, what's actually happening, though, is they're using their client's own natural ability to change the environment and claiming responsibility for it themselves. I think that almost every religious system does this. They tell people that any coincidence in the environment, any change that you see manifest when you pray for something is because our particular God, entity, or supernatural force is responsible for it. Thank you very much. Give me 10% of your salary. When in fact, the person who's experiencing it is the one who generated it. And, I'm very much into empowering people. I mean, one of the things I say in the book constantly is, I'm giving you a good story. I'm giving you an explanatory nonfiction. It's a way of explaining all this. But do not adapt my mythology, because you need to create your own. And I think very much, if you look at people, say, I've met people in my practice who have very fundamentalist religious views about, other people's sexuality, what other people are supposed to be doing according to God's word. Well, it used to be when I was younger, I sort of resented folks like that and wished they would grow up, evolve, or something. But I've realized now that these people are sincere. And what they're seeing is somebody gave them this belief system and then told them this is the way the universe works. Just stand on your doorstep and look out at the universe, and it'll confirm this for you. God will talk to you. So they get confirmations of whatever separatist belief system they already believe. And, that reinforces what other people have taught them. I would very much like people to realize that they create the meaning of the universe themselves, that they create these synchronistic events and patterns around them based on what they're thinking and feeling. And once they understand this, they have the choice of creating any pattern they want, and understanding that the people around them have the right to create different patterns. That, just because someone sees the universe in a fundamentally different way than you do, doesn't mean they're insecure or they're stupid. It means that what they're seeing in their mirror reflects the way they've been thinking about it. And that's not necessarily insincere. They're doing the best they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a lot of fear built into that system, too, that keeps them in that place. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kirby. I very much appreciate your explanations and your astute insights.
Thank you, Uranus Rising. That was a fascinating exchange. Ruski, I think you have a question for Dr. Surprise.
And yes, I do. Synchronicity is a word that was coined by the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung to describe the temporally coincident occurrences of acausal events. It was a principle that he felt encompassed his concept of the collective unconsciousness, and that it was descriptive of a governing dynamic that underlay the whole of human experience and history, social, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Jung believed that many experiences perceived as coincidence were due not merely to chance, but instead to potentially reflect the manifestation of coincident events or circumstances consequent to this governing dynamic. Jung spoke of synchronicity as being an acausal connecting principle, i.e., a pattern of connection that is not explained by causality. Jung believed that traditional notions of causality were incapable of explaining some of the more improbable forms of coincidence. Where it is plain, felt Jung, that no causal connection can be demonstrated between two events, but where there is a meaningful relationship nevertheless exists between them, a wholly different type of principle is likely to be operating. Jung called this principle synchronicity. Now, Dr. Kirby, how does your view of synchronicity differ from Jung, and what evidence can you provide to support your assertions?
Okay. So, with all due respect to Carl Jung, okay, he had a couple of problems. One was that he spent his whole life in conflict with Freud and the scientific community over his models, and he was a brave pioneer in talking about the collective unconscious. If you read his writings, he was actually brought out the concept of synchronicity late in his life, and he was very worried that this idea of acausal events and patterns would crash the more acceptable academic parts of his model because it's just too weird. In specific, he said that he was very afraid of saying that humans cause synchronistic events because it seemed too much like magical thinking, and there was no explanation. His basic the long articulate paragraph that you just read actually comes down to, that was really weird. What's going on here? and saying that we don't have a good explanation. He ultimately said he thought archetypes, these patterns of energy in psychoid space, which is space that is neither personal nor objective, were responsible for coordinating both our thoughts and the external events. He had no other good way of thinking about it. Certainly before we started realizing how multidimensional probability was, there wasn't a good way to think about it. But let me talk about a couple of things with Jung. His most famous example of synchronicity is a woman who was doing therapy with him who had this very rigid, logical pattern to her. She was not in touch with her emotions, and he was trying to do therapy to get her in touch with her emotions. But every time he would have interpret a dream of hers and try to get her near part of her emotional content, she would go analytical and intellectual, and he wouldn't be able to get there. So he describes being in a session with this woman, and she's talking about a dream she had in which a scarabed beetle was in the dream. And, my imagination for, Jung's part of this was that he's sitting there, listening to her intellectualize, thinking, oh my God, just shoot me now, because he couldn't get her to stop. He needed some way to break this woman out of thinking everything had an explanation. So they hear a tapping on the window outside the room where they're having the session. And he excuses himself and he gets up and goes to the window. And on the windowsill, trying to get in, is a large scarab beetle. So he walks over to the woman and hands it to her and says, here's the scarab from your dream. Now, there is no explanation for that logically. So it sort of breaks through the woman's, logical defenses and allows her to continue talking about emotions in the therapy. Now, Jung believes that these synchronistic events are archetypal. They come from patterns of energy outside of ourselves. But if you think about this event, there's no archetype here. What is clear is that what happened was a synchronistic event based on the internal content of both the client, who had the beetle in her dreams, and Jung's emotional desire to find a way to have her break through her resistances, which is what was actually given to him when the scarab showed up at the window. The pattern of the synchronistic event was the internal personal processes of Carl Jung and his client. If you look at, and I've accumulated hundreds of synchronistic events from people now, if you look at them with the mind of these are reflections of something the person has either been thinking or feeling recently, or something that is a long-term pattern they're working on in their life, then it becomes really clear that the events are mirrors of our personal stuff. Now, if Jung had claimed that we had these magical abilities, he would have been laughed at because there was no explanation. Until recently and until the book I just wrote came out, there was no logical explanation. There was a bunch of fragmented pieces of the physics and the psychology and the neuropsych, and the metaphysics that needed to be brought together. As far as proof goes, a contemporary of Jung was a guy named Dr. J.B. Rhine. He was at Duke University. He was a psychologist. And one day this guy comes to him and says, look, Doc, I'm a gambler. And I can make the dice come up a little more often in my favor than is random. So, at the time, most psychologists would just kick the guy out of the office. But being a real scientist, what Rhine did, well, he said, okay, tell you what, let's break out 6 dice in a notebook. And you do 100 tosses of the dice, and I'll record them all, and you try to make the number 6 come up more often than chance. So they sat down, they did it, and sure enough, this gambler was changing randomness of the dice tosses by 5 or 6%. There was no explanation, and Rhine became obsessed. He spent the next 35, 40 years looking at this phenomenon, became his career, created an institute around it. And he found that people in general change their environment 5 or 6%. Now, he did the obvious things. He, checked to see if there was some force being generated on the dice, if the guy was, palming them using sleight of hand. So he made machines that would do the dice automatically without being touched. He tried coin tosses. He tried, random events of all kinds, electrical discharges, many, many different things. The upshot was he found a couple of very strange things. He, for instance, took a bunch of gamblers and ran the experiment with them, and he took a bunch of preachers and ran it with them to see if, being spiritually oriented had some effect on your ability. And they found out no, it's not dependent on your spiritual state. People are doing it normally anyway. Then he gave people caffeine and found out your ability to change these random events increases when you've got a stimulant on board. Similarly, if you drink alcohol, the ability decreases. So there's a link to physiological processes in the brain. Your thoughts are more efficient and more focused when you've had a little caffeine. Then he found this very odd pattern. If you look at when people start doing a long run, say they're doing 100 dice tosses, in the very beginning, if you plotted it on the curve, their ability to change the randomness of the dice is up around 5 or 6% above normal, above random. Then, about 20 or 30 tosses into the run, the ability starts to disappear. It becomes random, and then a little further in, you actually start to inhibit the target that you're trying to make. So at the middle of the run, people were basically shooting themselves in the foot. The number they were looking for was coming up less often than was probable. Towards the end of the event, the end of the run, the ability comes back. And towards the very end, they finish up again with a 5 or 6% above normal ability to change the randomness of events. What he realized was he was seeing the people's attention and mood reflected in the experiment. At the very beginning, people were excited. It was new. It was interesting. Am I going to be able to change these dice? Will I see I have this ability? The interest and focus of attention caused the ability to increase. About a quarter of the way in, people start to get bored. Oh, man, I've thrown these things 20 times already. I got another 80 tosses to go. I don't know. I could be home watching TV. Oh, nice wallpaper you have there. And the ability decreases. They start to resent being there. They don't want to do it anymore. And they're starting to think about other things. And the not wanting to do it, the negative sort of connotation, actually depresses what they're looking for. But again, it's directly reflecting their internal state. Towards the end of the experiment, it starts to get interesting again. Oh, wow, I'm going to get to see how I did. This is going to be over soon. They sort of bring their attention back into focus, and the ability returns. Ryan figured out he was watching the emotional and mental patterns of the subjects change the randomness of events. Now, Jung saw this. He was aware of Ryan's experiment and said that this was a demonstration of synchronicity in the lab, but he was unwilling to cop to the actual conclusions that human beings were creating the effect, because that would have put him in deep water. He would have had to advocate with the psychological community that human beings could change your environment. Now, to take it to a wider scientific perspective, when I was trained in experimental design, we were told that the very best design for an experiment is a double-blind experiment. In this type of experiment, the subjects do not know what the experiment is looking for. They're blind to the purpose of the research. The person doing the hands-on carrying out of the experiment doesn't know either. So the hands-on part of the research team is also blind to the purpose of the experiment. Only the person who designed it originally knows what they're looking for, and they're not taking part. This is because we've realized that in the double-blind experiment, we realized that the act of observing an experiment changes the outcome. This is one of the most maddening things about scientific research. No matter what research you're doing, the fact that you're looking at the experiment expecting a certain thing to happen changes the outcome. Your mental and emotional patterns, the thought forms that you have generated, are changing probability in the actual experiment. And there's actually entire schools of statistical analysis based on how to remove that effect from the data. So it's not a new phenomenon. What is new is that I'm saying that we generate this, and there's actually a logical reason. There's actually a model that can explain how we do it. So Jung never came around to believing that human beings can make synchronistic events. He said that maybe there was an archetype of occult expectancy that if you expect synchronistic events to behave the way you want them to, then they do because there's some other archetype. Personally, I don't believe in archetypes. Whatever archetype you look for will show up. Jung has synchronistic events around the archetype of the fish because he was doing cross-cultural mythological research on the symbol of fish, and all these synchronistic events appeared about fish. He assumed that there was a fish archetype doing this. What I'm saying is a more simple, more direct explanation is he was thinking about fish. His attention, his emotional energy, his thought forms created the events he was seeing. But he was resistant to the idea that people do this. So, in practical terms, for anybody listening, instead of believing any model of synchronicity, go out and play with this. Okay? You're doing it already. What you see around you, the meanings you perceive, the patterns that you notice are based on the choices that you're making. You can create synchronistic events by looking for the specific patterns you want. For a lot of people in this society, I see particularly more like sort of rigid and conservative thinkers, they don't see synchronistic events. They will say this is impossible. Well, if you tell yourself from the time you're a child, if your parents teach you that these coincidences are just coincidences, that they're not meaningful events, and that you have no ability to influence such things, and you tell your unconscious this, it tags synchronistic events as something that are not important. It filters them out of your awareness, and you don't see them. If you realize that they're there and look for them, they appear. And in fact, the more attention you pay to them, the more profound they become, the more like cosmically important and intense they appear to be. But it's the energy of your attention and your emotion that causes the apparent manifestations of the pattern.
That is a fascinating explanation. This is something to certainly give me something to think about, something to noodle over. I have a question from a member by the name of Jules from our Aussie contingent, and his question is as follows. It's from the articles and interviews you have made. I have noticed that synchronistic events is a phrase used to describe the unexplained in one's life. Could you be lumping all events as synchronistic events when there are different reasons for the cause of these events? For example, the Aborigines, when hunting, indeed had feelings about where the herd was located, but to me, this was not synchronicity, but intuition. Could you elaborate whether you believe all strange coincidences are only ourselves seeing, interpreting what we are looking for, or could there be other reasons or sources of synchronistic events and coincidences?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm very sort of grounded and scientifically oriented in a lot of ways because there's a tremendous, let's put it this way, I have a tremendous ability to deceive myself, but convince myself of things. And what I've written about synchronicity as far as them being reflective is only one small aspect of what's out there. I mean, I have yet to see sort of proof of causes of synchronistic events that are not from the individual observing them. I mean, there are some sort of global ones people see in the culture, and I believe that we have intuition. Like, for instance, if we want to take sort of perennial mystical models of how reality works, it would make perfect sense that, intuition doesn't have to have anything to do with synchronicity at all. I mean, maybe your transmitter and receiver are picking up information from, these non-linearly time-oriented planes. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. I think that there's a danger in trying to simplify things down to one explanation. I think that it feels more comfortable for us to be able to take something very complicated and say, oh, it's just this. And some writers have done that with synchronicity. Charles Tart has suggested that synchronicity is sort of the granddaddy of all psychic phenomena, and that all of it could be explained in some way or linked in some way to synchronicity. And I'm very, very reticent to say that. I think that we are very complex beings, and that synchronicity is one type of event that we experience. I also have seen synchronistic events feed people information that they couldn't possibly have known, sort of, from other aspects of the self or from out there in spaces that I don't know where it comes from. So I would say the basic answer is no. I don't think synchronicity is responsible for everything. I think things are always complex. And I think that, it's much healthier to be comfortable in living in the joy and wonder of a universe that's more complex than you can understand.
Wonderful answer. Based on what you've said about the 5 to 6% probability in favor of influencing the outcome of dice, I think I'm going to take up a new career. I'm going to focus on those little cubes, and I'm going to go visit my favorite casino and see what happens.
Well, interestingly enough, casinos, people gamble are very superstitious. For a scientific basis, there's been a lot of studies of probability and chance. In fact, much of modern mathematics came from people trying to figure out gambling with games like dice. And luck and chance is lumpy. It comes in streaks. It comes in patterns. It's not just, sort of a random thing. Many casinos have known for decades that, when someone starts to win, you start to give them free drinks. Why? Well, the alcohol depresses the ability to make events come up in your favor. So in a very real sense, casinos are already aware of this and are already playing it by giving people the alcohol that makes their focus less.
Yeah, I know. I've learned that through bitter experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruski. We are speaking with Dr. Kirby Surprise. You can help support him and find out more about his work at howsynchronicityworks.com. Dr. Surprise, once we're aware of synchronistic events and begin looking for them, it's likely we'll see more of them. Do you think this is because we're co-creators and manufacture them, or is it that we're reprogramming our brains to see the ones that already exist?
Okay, I think it works in two different ways. The brain is always filtering and augmenting our reality for us. So if you look for synchronistic events, if you look for the patterns or even the fact that they exist, your unconscious is always sort of watching what you're doing and the choices that you're making and trying to accommodate you, trying to give you the information that you need to do the difficult tasks of navigating in the outside world. So very much so, if you look for synchronistic events expecting them to happen, sort of almost asking for it, the unconscious will start to show you the patterns around you that have already existed. In addition to that, if you're aware that you can create synchronistic events and you make a conscious effort to do that, you produce more of them. So it's sort of both. Yes, to some degree, it's a magic trick of the brain that shows you information that you may have been ignoring. But it's also a very direct reflection. And the more you look in this particular mirror, the more you see. So I know from experience that your ability to create and target very specific kinds of synchronistic events, it gets better with practice. I think partially this is because anything that you think, any skill that you focus on, your brain gets better at. You sort of neurologically rewire to get better at whatever it is you're trying to do. The same way athletes get better at movement. Same thing with synchronicity. The more you look and the more you consciously try to create, the better you get at it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And then, do you think that precognitive abilities and synchronistic events are related? If so, is it possible to strengthen that precognitive ability through synchronistic events? And are synchronistic events merely a reflection of our subconscious and only reflect our fears if we are subconsciously fearful?
I think it's much simpler than saying, it only does this if that, if this, if that. It's a very direct mirror. So what you're seeing is a mirror image of your conscious thoughts, your unconscious processes, and even your transpersonal and spiritual processes as well. You see it all reflected in this mirror. So, you can choose to focus on different kinds of information, and they'll get augmented for you. But you're basically getting a reflection of everything at once. I think that precognition and clairvoyant abilities are separate issues. I certainly have seen synchronistic events that give me information about what's coming up next, sort of, that I would not have guessed. But generally, they're reflective. If you have strong psychic abilities, you're going to see synchronistic events feeding you information that you could have gotten through other channels anyway. If you have a particular way that you use guided imagery, meditation, for self-connection, reflection, or cognition, you can just as easily shift all those processes into looking for them through synchronistic events. You can literally play the environment like a video game and have it give you information. What I haven't seen is synchronistic events giving people information they otherwise could not have gotten. So, for instance, I had clients who have presented me with synchronicities that seem precognitive. Well, in fact, the individual was precognitive, not the events. They choose to become aware of their precognitive ability through the information they get reflected in the mirror, but they could have just as easily done it just internally. So I think that, it's a different issue. Okay, whatever you've already got is going to be reflected in the mirror. If you look in the mirror really deeply, then you're just going to see deeper versions of what's already there.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And Uranus Rising has the next question.
I know you already touched on this a little bit, but I'm hoping you can flesh it out a bit. Would you explain how synchronistic events are driven by emotional and mental contents?
Sure. One of the things that's been useful for me is to take sort of this classical model of planes of consciousness and explain synchronicity according to one plane at a time. So, for instance, if we look at a system that says there's a physical, an astral, and a mental plane, there's 3 different ways of explaining synchronicity. Now, none of them work separately. They're all intermeshed and entwined. But looking at 3 slightly different ways of explaining it is kind of helpful. The physical explanation is that you're looking at the way the data in your brain is selectively processed, that synchronistic events are occurring because your brain is highlighting patterns that you think that it thinks you're interested in. Now, the brain operates on a thing called emotional valence. You don't remember things that have no emotional importance to you. So, for instance, a couple of years ago, I was driving to work. It's a long drive, and I was driving to work in the morning in the dark on a highway. And the highway is about 40 miles of uninterrupted road. I really didn't have any emotional interest in going to work that day. I was sort of sitting in the car thinking, running my train of thought. Suddenly, I realized I was 20 miles past my exit.
Oh, no.
No memory of having gone by. And, I just suddenly was like confused because I didn't know where I was. This is what happens. In order to process things into memory, they have to have emotional valence, an emotional charge to them. Otherwise, they never pass from short-term to long-term memory. I had no emotional significance attached to getting to work whatsoever. It's not that I didn't want to be there or that I did want to be there. What I was thinking about was much more important. So I removed all the emotional valence from the task of driving to work. Now, obviously, in that blank period, I was driving. I was maintaining the lanes and, dealing with the other cars and the speed limits. What happened, though, is because I was totally disinterested, I never formed any memories of doing it. So it seems amnesic, not because you weren't there at the time, but because no memories are formed of it. Now,
and that's because there's no emotional investment in it, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, a physical explanation for synchronistic events is that you are seeing patterns based on the emotional valence you've had in the past for elements that are in those patterns. You're seeing your unconscious is showing you, out of the millions of patterns around you, patterns of your thought and feeling that have emotional valence for you. It's doing its job. It's trying to point out what might be useful to you in the environment. Now, it also completes incomplete patterns. So one of the things I do, and it's in the book as well, is people report these amazing synchronistic events, and I tell them, well, go back and really carefully retrace all the events and compare everything. And they find that their brain added things often, that, the name was a little different than they thought it was. The circumstances weren't quite the same. Perhaps the synchronistic event isn't really as causative as it looked because your brain has changed the content for you. It's filled in the pattern to show you a pattern that you more normally look for. So,
Okay, that makes sense, yes.
right. So to some degree, the physical explanation is your brain is doing this for you. Now, if you go up one plane and talk about the astral, emotional, this is more like talking about gravitation. So the more intense an emotional reaction is, the denser the thought form is. Most people have seen pictures of a gravity well. It's sort of, there's a planet, and it's making this little gravity well around it, and things start to circle when they fall into the well. Okay, it's Einstein saying that, gravity is caused by space being curved by the presence of an object. You can think of thought forms that way, that they exist not in one single moment the way our conscious awareness seems to, but on the astral, it's a range of time, a block of time. Therefore, a thought form there affects events here over a range of time. The more intense the emotion, the denser the form, the greater the clustering of synchronistic events that happens here. In a way, this explanation does look like Jung's concept of an archetype. He would say archetypes are these energy patterns that make events cluster around them in their pattern. And that the synchronistic event is there because events have clustered around this little gravity well of an archetype, and so have your thoughts. What I'm saying is, no, not a universal pattern, a personal pattern that you produce in these sort of free-form thought forms around you, essentially a tiny temporary archetype of your thoughts and emotions that's capable of bending the matrix of events around you in order to produce a synchronistic event. Now, this explanation is very much like Einstein's special and general relativity, but it also requires sort of energy to do it. And it's presupposing that some of the events in the environment are being altered. One plane up, doing a mental plane model, this is the probability model, where you're immersed in an infinite amount of slightly different alternative probabilities, and that the direction of your thoughts and emotions is directing your course amongst the infinite amount of already existing probabilities around you until your thoughts more closely match the reality you're existing in that was already there beforehand. Now, we're sort of stuck with the dilemma of the way we think about things is based on our neurophysiology. For instance, raccoons always wash things before they eat them. They take them down to a stream and they wash them. It's a genetic, species-specific behavior. They have to do it. They couldn't think about doing it any other way. When I talk about planes of consciousness in the brain, I'm saying that the physical is roughly the brainstem. The limbic midbrain systems are roughly the astral emotional systems. And the cortex, the outer thinking part, is roughly what we consider the mental plane. There's no real way of untangling whether or not we think about the universe because our brain is structured this way, or if our brain is structured this way because it reflects the actual structure of the universe. We're sort of stuck in this dilemma of all of our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences, and our senses of meaning are definitely neurological patterns. All of them are reflected by brain activity. And I think that if we remain aware that our metaphysical explanations of things like synchronicity may very heavily simply be following the physiology of how we're designed to think, that also leaves open again the joy of not being certain about any of this. So, there may actually be better explanations for synchronicity. And one of the things I say in the book is I'm very sure that this mythology I have created around them, there'll be a better one in 50 years. But for now, the upshot is that you create synchronistic events, that you have the ability to create any pattern in the environment you want. That this is a joy. This is play on a cosmic scale. That is not to be feared. It's not to be worried about. It's also not a particular indication of high spiritual development. Everybody does this.
I love that. And I love that it's natural. It's just noticing it, that we're all capable of it. But if synchronicity is messy and a mirror into the unconscious, how does someone go about understanding those thoughts in a healthy manner rather than using synchronistic events as confirmation of, say, a fantasy or a negative delusional state that may not be in one's own best interest? As more people become aware of synchronicity, it seems like there could be a trap of people beginning to use synchronistic events to support their belief system or act like it's an objective truth.
Yes, that's exactly the point. That's why I wrote the book. Because people exist in a world that reflects what they believe. They come to believe what they think, essentially. They come to live in a world that reflects what they already think. The whole purpose of the book is very much to also point out the various little pit traps people fall into with synchronicity. People that scare themselves silly with paranoia, or, become worried that they themselves have some cosmic unwarranted significance that then they become guilty and weird about. When in fact it's just a reflection of what you're already doing. And knowing this, there's no onus that this is cosmically important. It's as important as you want to make it. It's also a tremendous amount of fun. This is an extremely creative activity. James Joyce wrote Ulysses, about a guy who's wandering through his everyday life, reliving the myth of Ulysses. We do this all the time. We relive the myth of our family of origin, of, what happens when the parent is disapproving, or a competition with a sibling, or all of these psychological patterns become, the mythology that we live in the actual world. How many times have you seen someone that replay a relationship that doesn't work in their lives with somebody else over and over again? They seem
all people do it all the time until they wake up to it, I would say.
Right. And what happens is that original psychodynamic developmental pattern is projected into the environment, and it sort of attracts people that have the same needs.
And doesn't it also then ask the other person to behave in the expected manner that one's used to?
Absolutely. And we often accommodate each other. So the thing about choice in this is, if you know this, you have the choice of not believing everything you think just because you think it, and going out and looking for the things that, you actually want, regardless of how it's actually happening. One of the amazing things is, the conscious part of us, this tiny piece on the frontal lobe of the brain, is not supposed to know everything. You're supposed to know just enough to get along with interacting with the environment. The massive amount of us, the biggest amount of what we are as beings, is unconscious. It's automated to us. It's supportive, and it's highly complex, and it will always be much more complex than be consciously understood. This is okay. We seem to have this idea in modern culture that we have to understand everything.
But where's the mystery in that?
Right, exactly. The mystery is, the fact is, our brain's only 3 pounds, and the universe is 13.7 billion light years across. We're not going to get it all. I think our job is not only just to get our needs met, but to enjoy and revel in the beauty of the complexity without being freaked out by it. To some degree, synchronistic events are the same thing. Synchronistic events are based in meaning. As in computer terms, determining meaning is extremely difficult. I mean, no computer in the world can tell you what something means. Only your brain, that miracle supercomputer in your head, can do things like that. So, for example, if I were to ask you to, on the spur of the moment, add 12 10-digit numbers in your head, you can't. It's impossible. We don't have the kind of minds that do that. We weren't evolved to do addition in that way. However, we were evolved to run through the grass at a high speed with a spear, chasing ever-changing patterns all around us, keeping aware of other predators. That task is more complex computationally than every computer on the planet can handle. And yet, we can't add a list of numbers together because we weren't evolved to have to do that task. Fortunately for us, we were evolved to play with patterns. That's what our evolutionary niche actually is. We're not fast, we're not strong, we don't have sharp teeth and claws. We have brains that match patterns, that look for meaning in the environment. That is the essence of what synchronistic events are. We look for the meaning in the patterns around us. We also just so happen to have this ability, 5 or 6% usually, to change those patterns as well. But it's a naturally evolved ability that's there to help you survive and get what you would like from the world.
And it opens up so many doors too. It's wonderful. In your book, you also wrote that to be careful of addiction or obsession with synchronistic events. And you reminded us that people are more important, much more important. What other advice do you have to offer those of us who would like to create our own synchronistic events?
The best thing you could possibly do would be to buy my book and look at the exercises chapter.
Good answer. Good answer. That's great.
Seriously, though, okay? And my publisher doesn't like me telling people this, but you don't have to buy the book to learn how to do this. You don't have to anybody really teach you how to do it, although, I am teaching people how to do it. It's a natural ability. You do it already. The book has a series of exercises in it that show step by step how to create things as simple as just a basic reflection of a thought, or how to create a complete personal mythology in the environment around you. I mean, if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, you can live in a world that reflects Lord of the Rings if you want to. You have these abilities. The point is to have a sense of humor about it, a sense of creativity about it.
And like you said, enjoy it.
Yeah, people are unnaturally afraid of their own thoughts and feelings. And I think to some degree, because we live in societies that are governed, where these various people have various interests for us, both politically and economically. They don't teach people to think for themselves. What we're taught from a very early age is don't be weird, don't be different, and only think along certain lines. Like, for instance, in my very early childhood, my parents were Roman Catholic, and I was always impressed by the fact that we were told repeatedly the age of miracles was over. That, there were miracles that happened back at the end of the New Testament, and that was it. That was the end of it. Now just sort of like, pray and hope that somebody pays attention to you. Well, that's a way of disempowering people. What they should be telling people is, these events are not miracles. They're completely natural, and they happen all the time. And, oh, by the way, you have as much ability to not only produce them, but to say what they mean as anybody else. So very much what I'm saying, is sort of antithetical to priesthoods, gurus, shamans. I'm saying it's you. And spiritually, the section in the book, several sections on Zen Buddhist philosophy and enlightenment. In Buddhism, there's a term called satori. It's the experience where the sense that there is an internal and external world dissolves, and that you realize there is only one consciousness. Your individuality flows seamlessly between you and the collective. There's no difference. There's an ecstatic experience where you are one. Or, as the bad joke goes, the Dalai Lama goes up to the hot dog stand and says, "Make me one with everything." Well, we're finding out little wonderful things with neurophysiology. We have scanners now that watch your brain think in real time. And they do studies of people who can produce the Satori state. And they find out, for instance, that, well, essentially what happens is the left real parietal part of the brain goes dark. Brain activity in an area that defines your sense of self stops. So you have no sense of self, you're joined with the environment. Individuality is an illusion created by brain processing. Our sense of the way time actually works is an illusion of the way our brain processes information. Synchronistic events are tiny demonstrations that you are not separate from your environment. They are small enlightenment experiences, small satori. You are seeing aspects of yourself, of your thoughts and your emotions reflected directly off the environment around you. That is a direct indication that you are not a limited physical being. Part of you, in fact, lives sort of behind the scenes here and is capable of making changes and adjustments on where you are in non-physical reality. So synchronicity can be a spiritual path to realize how connected we all are. My own personal opinion is that religion has nothing to do with spirituality. Religion is a set of rules, dictates, behavioral mandates, directions on who gets your money and who has the power and authority.
You're here.
Yeah. Synchronicity is, in spirituality, in my opinion, is demonstrations that there is no difference between people and the environment, that things are connected. Things are, in fact, one. I had this, I was thinking about this concept one evening. I was watching TV, and Larry King was doing an interview with this conservative religious leader who was, at the time, he was rallying against gay rights on TV, on biblical premises. And I looked at this guy, and there was some particular coincidence involved, where I connected what was going on. And suddenly it became hysterically funny, not tragic and bigoted, but funny, because essentially even physics will tell you that there is no separation between objects. Particles are things where the density of space is a little higher in one place than another, but it's all the same field. It's all twists in the same cloth. So here's this guy saying that he understands what God wants for everybody, and there's a glass of water on the table between him and Larry King, and this guy thinks that he's separate from the glass of water. This believes in separate objects. He thinks Larry King is a separate individual, and he thinks that these people whose rights that he wants to remove are different from him. And instead of being critical, the reality of it was that it was hysterically funny.
Absurd sounds like.
Absurd that, this guy thought that, there was a God separate from us that we were not connected to that was giving instructions. And synchronicity for me is a way of demonstrating that we're all connected, that, there is no separation. And as far as, moral and ethical codes go, I don't believe there's a complex lesson here, but if you truly understand that you are not separate from the person you're talking to, you're much more likely to behave in an empathetic and wise manner towards that person. And I think synchronicity can be a path to the demonstration of that non-separateness.
Beautifully put. Thank you very much, Dr. Surprise. I very much appreciate that thought.
Thank you, Uranus Rising. Dr. Surprise, Plain has a question for you.
Dr. Surprise, I've got a question from our member BBBSH Build, and that is, if individuals in essence create synchronistic events, do large groups of people as a collective have the same ability and create the same synchronistic event for all and affecting all in a meaningful manner?
Again, it comes down to which version of what creation is. I operate, when I do it, from the probability model, sort of the mental plane model, in which there are an almost infinite amount of probable universes in play, and that you're simply bringing yourself into alignment with the ones that more closely match your internal processes. It's a very difficult, the collective additive nature is a difficult one. If you're looking at sort of an astral explanation where the thought forms have mass, yeah, you could think about it that way. I think that's a low energy way of doing it personally. I also think it's almost impossible, seeing as these are not physical things that you're experimenting with, to give yourself a precise answer. There's no way, because, if you get 5 people together thinking the same thing, well, they're essentially, all 5 of them are choosing their individual position and probability for themselves anyway. It can appear collective because they're all using the same patterns, but there's no way to really determine what the reality is. And unfortunately, we're not dealing with something where there's instrumentation that can measure it. I tend to like to err on degrees of freedom, and I think the idea that you are creating your own experience and positioning yourself in your own worlds of meaning is much more practical. I also tend to think, from my studies of meditation, mysticism, and shamanism, that there is sort of different degrees of development here. So, for instance, some of the ancient schools of mysticism taught spiritual path as climbing up the planes of consciousness. Instead of like moral values, devotional character values, they literally was, how far up the astral mental plane can you displace your consciousness? Lower levels of the astral plane seem very much like some quote-unquote primitive shamanic systems where there are individual beings and spirits and natural forces and all kinds of sort of things wandering around. The further up you go, the planal structures, though, the more collective things get. Things go from being distinct individual entities or objects to being collective, merged, one being aspects of the other, till when you're playing with things on the mental plane, what you're actually seeing is your thoughts, where, if you see an object on the lower astral that may seem like a separate entity, if you look at the same thing from up on the mental plane somewhere, it's one of your thoughts. It depends on the perspective that you want to choose. I do believe that you cannot harm anyone with synchronistic events. I believe that everything in the universe, despite its appearance to us as individuals, exists in a state of grace. That, we have responsibility to be kind to each other, but I don't believe that we can exclude or force our will either individually or collectively.
Well, then that raises a couple of questions about intent. So in the starting one about Dr. Rhine and the dice, obviously if you're gambling in a casino with other people, they're making bets too. So, if you're making 6 come up more than it should, then, others may lose because of that. And you've talked a bit about Bobby Fischer and, playing chess. I mean, some things in this world, there will be losers. So, can intent be negative? And, to what extent does intent play a role in synchronicity?
I've never tried to synchronistically trick somebody, so I really don't know. This is not a satisfying explanation. I'm sorry if it sort of dodges the direct question. But people ask me, well, if we can influence synchronistic events, how come we can't win the lottery? Well, winning the lottery is millions to one. And I'm saying you have a 7%, 6% chance of changing probability. So I believe that although you can influence things around you to some degree, you're not creating the reality. You're also not tweaking it so heavily that I think that you're denying opportunity to anybody else around you. In a very real sense, and I understand this is extremely difficult to swallow, in a very real sense, all 12 people hanging around the dice table are living in many multiple probabilities simultaneously from each other and are not affecting the outcome for each other. Now, I realize that that's a difficult thing to swallow, that they're not all living in the same set of realities. But this is sort of the paradigm shift. This is going, if you told somebody 2,000 years ago that the earth wasn't flat, they would kind of think you were crazy because it's obvious. I mean, you look out and the world is flat and, everything is flat and it's perfectly obvious. Well, it's sort of the situation at the dice table where it would seem perfectly obvious that if one person wins, another person has to lose. Well, in fact, that's because that's the way you think about causation. In reality, there's many independent realities operating simultaneously. It's not just one timeline. We're understanding now there's more than one kind of time. There's more than one kind of causation. And dealing with synchronicity is ever maddening because you're dealing with something whose essence is meaning. And meaning can only be derived by the person experiencing it. It can only be generated by the brain that's crunching the data. Synchronistic events are not based on cause and effect.
One little follow-up to that. What about something that's really big, like, one guy throwing some dice is a really small thing. But what if we were referring to something bigger, like the exchange rate for the euro and the dollar or something like that, that tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people are gambling on every day? Would the size of that overwhelm any sense of intention?
I don't know. I do know that synchronistic events do not seem to pay any heed to scale, time period, energy, mass, any of those things. If you were going to try to play with the stock exchange, it's an interesting question, but you'd have to be doing something more than focusing on numbers. It would have to have some emotional valence for you. Now, I would be more than happy if there's any millionaires listening who would like to fund me on a 5-year research project to play with the stock exchange. Just give me a call, and I'd be happy to ride on your dime for a couple of years. Personally, I think that the real value of synchronistic events is for communicating with yourself. It's meaningful communication between other aspects of yourself that you're not immediately consciously aware of. A lot of this, I can't answer the questions. Nobody can. My experience has been that these events operate according to the meanings of the person who perceives them, that trying to make them collective is doing the flat earth model. It seems logical, but it never actually works. Like, for instance, when in the 70s, when Skylab was falling, there was like 20 or 30 million people got together to try to telekinetically push the lab back into orbit. There wasn't 1 gram worth of effect on it. It fell in exactly the way they said it was going to. I don't think they're collective. I think that we live in individual realities that, in individual clusters of probability. And as hard as it is to swallow, I don't think that synchronicity is cumulative in that way.
Okay, thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Plain. Dr. Surprise, I have a question for you from Chipper Dog. In your opinion, does the use of synchronistic events and symbols to represent what is unconscious become less so the more aware and sensitive one becomes to synchronistic events?
It would depend on what they mean by less so. The goal of any therapy, any psychological treatment, if it's psychodynamic, if it's Jungian, it's behavioral, is to give people a greater amount of choice about their actions. And that's, I think, what, in essence, synchronicity does. If you're aware that you're projecting your own content, you then have a choice about what you think and what you validate, and and what direction you want that to take you. It becomes a tool. Things can be made overly complex in synchronicity. I think that what I would like people to understand is that it is very much a personal mirror. And because you can make whatever faces in the mirror that you want to in your own time, you can sort of make whatever pattern you want in the synchronicity also. And I think that its best use is communicating with yourself and enjoying yourself with this ability.
Okay, that's a great answer. Thank you. We are speaking with Dr. Kirby Surprise, the author of Synchronicity, The Art of Coincidence, Choice, and Unlocking Your Mind. Dr. Surprise, can you tell our listening audience where they can find your book?
Yeah, the book's available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, many different independent booksellers. It's available in both paper and electronic versions. It's on Nook, Kindle. It's on PDF files. Simply type in Synchronicity, Art of Coincidence, Choice, and Unlocking Your Mind. in almost any of the major booksellers, and it will be available.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're going to move on to exploring thoughts on synchronistic events, and Uranus Rising has a question for you.
Dr. Surprise, you talk about synchronistic events as being a product of our minds projected out or affecting the material world. I wonder if it is also the other way around, that the material world, as a manifestation of our collective universal mind, which is not separate from us, projects onto us or affects us as individuals. For instance, the example you use of thinking about the power of the mind to crush a house and then witnessing a house being crushed in front of you. Could all these events conspire together, both your mind and the collective mind or universe, so that you could bring to conscious awareness synchronistic events?
Yes, I think if we use the physical world as an analogy, certainly the world around us affects us and shapes us in our processes constantly. I think that synchronicity is a demonstration that there is actually no separation, that there is a free flow between the environment and us, but that, ultimately, I don't believe in that separation. I think that we and the environment are one energy. We're one entity. There's only one being, one manifestation in the universe. And certainly, we affect it, it affects us. I'm careful in the book and in my talks on synchronicity, though, not to go too far out into speculation. Beyond the basic facts of physical reality, we're dealing with meanings that we create and assume ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very easy to get sort of self-referential and delusional and, self-deceptive about this. If indeed you can project any set of meanings on the environment you like, if you project, that the belief that there is a universalized consciousness directing events or a non-physical force of any kind creating synchronicity, you will see that pattern manifest in the environment around you. The problem is it's impossible to prove the legitimacy of non-physical events. So what I try to do is science is wonderful. One of the things I most love about the scientific method, something that's often misused by scientists, is that science does not tell people what's true. Science is designed to tell you what's most likely to be true. It's all based on statistics. What is the probability that this particular belief or pattern is in fact the correct set of relationships? It does not rule out things simply because, that's not possible. So if I'm talking to 2 or 3 different people who claim to be scientists, and I talk to them about synchronicity, in my personal opinion, the ones that say, well, you're talking about non-physical possibilities, and I don't have any way of measuring that, so I'm just going to let that go for now in one way or the other. I respect that guy. That's a scientist. He's saying I can't disprove it, so it's possible. Another guy might say, synchronistic events, thoughts being mirrored in the environment, that's just not possible. That guy's not a real scientist. Okay, he's a person with an opinion. Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction writer and scientist, is a wonderful guy. He said that when a senior scientist claims that something is possible, that it's most likely possible, and that when a senior scientist claims that something is not possible, he's probably wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The base thing is I try to keep close to what's most likely true. And from everything I've seen in the research and what I understand about neurophysiology and the way the mind works, synchronicity as a mirrored reflection of the environment, hands down, odds are billions to 1, that's absolutely correct. Beyond that, what's hanging out there in the universe as energy patterns or things that are non-physical that I can't directly measure, I don't give an opinion on them. I don't discount them. It's just that I don't have any way of putting my hands on them and testing them, which is different to say that they don't exist. I try to keep a very open mind. Otherwise, I start to believe what I'm thinking, and we all know where that goes.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Appreciate your clarity of thought there. I have another question for you. At the present time, many people are experiencing increasing chaos, uncertainty, and impossibility in their lives and in the world. This may be in their jobs, their family, the overall economic situation, continued world conflicts, and much more. As this increases, everything can feel like an impossible task. Well, in your book, you wrote about Zen koans, which are set as an impossible task to crash the neural network to catch a cosmic buzz, which you described as a poor way of inducing Satori and not to do it on one's own. Well, I've been thinking about this, and I was wondering if, because so many are facing these impossible tasks or situations, if this might be sort of like a collective or global koan we're possibly facing. And if this is a possibility, what advice would you have if we find ourselves in this situation?
Well, I think again that this question presumes the ability to understand causes and patterns in the universe that I don't have. I look at the world in general and the state it's in, and I think much more in terms of, greedy, sort of self-centered people doing short-sighted things that have negative effects on other people in a very sort of cause and effect kind of way. In our lives individually, I think that synchronicity can give you that 5 or 6% edge in finding what you need. Even material things such as job hunting, looking for a new used car, things like that. I think that we are subject to the limits of the inertia of physical reality, that a lot of the problems we experience are inherent to having physical form and being in a world that operates, sort of with the inertia of physical activity. I very much do not believe that I understand the sort of cosmic patterns in the universe. I've certainly, read many other people's presumptions about that, but I try to keep things close to the things I can be reasonably assured are possible. For synchronicity, again, it's not satisfying, but that's more keeping in the realms of individuals create these experiences and individuals interpret them. I'd rather leave sort of the globalized patterns occurring in the wider society to people that maybe have a higher consciousness or more understanding than I do.
Well, that's a very honest answer, and I very much respect that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uranus Rising. Plain, you have a question for Dr. Surprise?
Yes, Doctor. This is somewhat related to the last question, but it's just a general, how can one improve one's life or immediate world, I guess, by understanding or using synchronicity? So you refer to people being able to influence reality by about 5%, and you just stated that it's kind of not at a global kind of thing. It's more at a smaller level. But can one do anything to mitigate problems?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you give us a few examples, maybe?
Sure. There's different. Well, first, I'm going to give you the psychologist answer, if you don't mind.
I'll suffer through it.
Yes, suffer through it. Exactly. There is a difference between pain and suffering. Pain is sort of things that may be inflicted upon you by circumstances from the environment. Suffering is what you do to yourself as a result of having experienced the pain. So people can very much sort of focus on the thing that they didn't want to happen that's causing them grief, and they can amplify it. If you focus on the darker things about, the world looks like a very dark place. The world and the universe around us is meaningless. It has inherent in its structure and energy no meaning. It is just what it is. It's like, I am that I am. Meaning comes from our individual interpretation of how it relates to us. And we very much get to choose what things mean. Now, neurologically, our senses are processed, we create this view of reality, and then the limbic system in the brain, the midbrain emotional system, gives a charge to the experience. So we may see something happen outside of us, and we may have an initial reaction of maybe fear. So, for instance, many people have had the experience of walking along a path in the woods, and then suddenly they jump out of fear because they think there's a snake on the path. Then, after they've jumped away, they look back and they see that the snake is actually a stick. What's happened is the very fast but inaccurate parts of the brain in the very center, the older parts, are made to keep us out of danger. They see a partial pattern representation on the stick and assume it might be a snake and give you the snake signal instantly. When you've jumped back and have a chance to look at the situation more completely, to have the cortex, the newer but more accurate parts of the brain do the full analysis, then in context you can see, and in detail, no, that's not a snake, it's just a stick. The world hasn't changed. At first you thought it was a fearful world, and then it was like, oh, it's okay, it's just a stick. The meanings are generated by us. Synchronicity is a reminder that we choose what the meanings are. And if you look for, opportunity, for understanding, for sort of empathy and love in the world, if you look for instances that demonstrate that human beings are largely cooperative as a species and have built this civilization based on billions of hours of cooperative effort, the world looks like a positive place. If you look at what's wrong with the world, that we're polluting, that we've generated wars, that we treat each other unkindly, the world becomes a darker place. But ultimately, the world itself has no meaning. We do this. Synchronicity can help us point out that we can live in a world that is based on the type of meanings that we want to experience. No, we cannot completely get away from people who are sociopathic or, who are unconscious. But we can look at the beauty in the world. And we can use synchronicity to live a life that shows us the things that we would more like to encounter in our lives rather than the things that we would like to avoid in our lives. And that is a matter of choice.
Well, thanks for the answer. I have to think about the whole. You're basically saying that we need to look on the bright side of life, right? The sunny side of life. And with that, synchronicity can help. Is that a fair
Yes, that's a very
interpretation there?
A fair distilling of a long-winded answer, yeah. Yeah, okay, look on the sunny side of life because that'll give you a 5% better chance of having good things happen.
Okay, thank you, Doc. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Plain. Ruski, you have a question for Dr. Surprise?
Yes, I most certainly do. It's from a member, McLaren. Dr. Surprise, will you speak about your views of the unconscious/subconscious? Do you believe it only exists at a person level, or can it exist across multiple levels? Person, multiple individual, group, and collective. Is it possible that unconscious/subconscious exists multiple layers? Is it possible for synchronistic events to arise out of the not personal but the collective consciousness?
Yes.
A great answer. Would you care to amplify upon that?
Yeah. I believe that everything is collective. I believe that individuality is an illusion created by the brain's processing. That, everything that our sort of mystical traditions and our clairvoyants and our seers and, at the better of our heads of religions have been telling us is that it is collective. That it's sort of, as you progress along the path, things become increasingly connected, and the fact that there are no separate anythings becomes more and more obvious. So, yeah, I believe there's many collective aspects to a lot of things. I believe that I don't have the kind of consciousness that can point out particular patterns in synchronicity and determine that, that's a seventh chakra soul cluster as opposed to, a fifth ray monadic projection. I just don't have that kind of mind or perception. So I try to keep it simple and down on the personal level and say that, these events can be used to communicate more directly with more collective aspects of the self, but that I think people need to determine their own mythology.
Interesting. When you talk about synchronicity and you talk about the unconscious and you say that we're all connected, from what I'm inferring is you're basically saying synchronicity really is a manifestation of our collective mind.
You know, again, on a lower level model, sort of on an emotional, limbic, astral model, yeah. But, you know, we've evolved past that. You know, so for instance, keeping the metaphors sloppily mixed here, you know, the cortex, the older outer part of the brain that does the more complex thinking, that's the mental plane, you know, and it doesn't have the same kind of limitations. So, you know, I think that if you choose to live in a world of meaning where, you know, you're intimately tied to the actions and energies of those around you, the world's going to look that way. If you choose to take the more probability-oriented model that separates out, you know, where you are in probability from other people, then the world will behave that way. How the universe actually ultimately behaves, what the real sort of metaphysical physics of the universe is, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to see that in my lifetime. I do know that for now, the model of synchronicity I'm presenting of you're not being responsible for anybody else's coincidences and being, you know, the ability to position yourself in probability where you like, and that it can appear like a mirror, is probably a workable explanation of synchronicity. You know, it allows people to use this ability immediately. Is it ultimately going to be found to be the true metaphysical model of how this works? I simply don't know. I do think it's the best available model at this moment.
I must say that you've written a most remarkable text. Had you been one of my professors in university way back when I was studying psychology, I might have actually gone on to grad school. Instead, I was subjected to gentle ministrations of dealing with behavioralists who told me that consciousness was nothing more than an epiphenomenon of physiological processes. Anyways, enough of my ramblings.
Thank you, Ruski. Dr. Surprise, I have a question for you about synchromysticism, which is a study of coincidences, synchronicities, connections, esoterica, symbolism, and possible hidden agendas in all aspects of reality. Everything's connected. Author and mystic Neil Kramer goes on to state, critics of the value of synchromysticism often overlook the necessity of moving beyond Newtonian Cartesian causal models of linear time. The broader perspective of a higher dimensional quantum modality is required to grasp how messages that appear to be guided outside of current timeframes, especially from the invisible future, can present highly synchronous and prescient information about a given subject in the present moment. What are your thoughts regarding synchronicities existing outside linear time and therefore may have more mysticism than science or rationale can explain?
I agree with his general perspective with a few caveats. People misuse the word quantum constantly, you know, as if quantum was some kind of large jump. A quantum is the smallest possible difference between two systems. So, you know, when people talk about a quantum modality, he's actually talking about the smallest possible modality. I think that in essence, what he's saying is there's different kinds of time, and I think that's absolutely borne out by what we currently understand in physics. You know, linear time is not the only time. I mean, even Einstein, whose model has been supplanted by string theory, taught us that time was a variable. Time is nothing fixed. Even the physical linear time is not something that's cast in stone. You know, you can speed up, slow down, catch up to it, change it according to your speed and your mass. And now that we have all these other dimensions of physical reality, there are other types of time. Think of it this way. Einstein proposed a field theory, that everything was one large energy field, that this field was expanding at the speed of light through a dimension called time. That's why you slow down when you go real fast. You're catching up with the rate time passes. I believe that our ancestors and mystics talking about physics, about emotional, mental, about astral and mental planes, they're talking about very real energy fields. And being as they are, have an extra dimension to them. They're more than physically dimension. They have an additional quality of time as well. My personal opinion is that this emotional plane we talk about, that I parallel to the limbic systems in the brain, the astral plane, that there objects exist not as moments in time, but as areas of time. So here, physical objects on the physical have, height, space, depth and width. That's the characteristics of an object, but they exist in one moment of time at once. I believe that these emotional astral objects, these thought forms that I talk about, their existence, it also has a dimension of time in addition, which means they exist not just in a single moment of time, but they exist somewhat in the past and somewhat in the future simultaneously, which gets also back to the question. Because they exist in more than one place, one area of time simultaneously, they affect conditions here, not just in the present moment, but somewhat in the past and future, and in some ways can be helpful in developing synchronistic events, because they're sort of gravitationally tweak the event sequences around us. The mental plane is an additional dimension. It's also another kind of time. It's a kind of time where all possibility exists in one single moment. And then you're just picking out variations of what's possible in a single eternal moment of now. Each of these models presents time a little bit more expanded, a little less linear, and a little more inclusive. All of our mysticism and our spiritual paths generally follow this idea that we go from single, individualistic, separated appearances in the universe to more collective, more unified, more singular awareness. And that ultimately, what we're looking at is one field of energy, one ground dimension of some kind that breaks up and gives us the illusion of an infinite number of possibilities and dimensions, but all of them stem from one essential underlying field.
Okay, that gives me a lot to think about. I appreciate that answer. And Dr. Surprise, Plain has a follow-up question for you.
Doctor, I wanted to throw something out there just to get your take on it. In your writings or in your thinking, have you dealt with the idea of past lives or, for that matter, multiple lives? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I've studied the perennial philosophy and sort of the theosophy of it. I tend to think that, take sort of the Buddhist view, the purist view, which is that those things are really interesting and they're all possible, but what's really important is the way we treat each other in this lifetime right now. I mean, I'm willing to wait for my next lifetime to find out if there is going to be one.
Fair enough. That's fair enough. I was just kind of curious because, as you get into the what shall we say, above the plane of the merely physical, then you start wondering how it all puts, how it all holds together. And it just seems like maybe a lot of what we see as being hard to understand is actually because of some relationship between, let's say, other lives or, other timelines, that kind of thing. And while it's true we have to live in the now, we probably have to keep our spirits in as many planes as we can or something.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, in some ways, I view spiritual development as sort of increasing your range on the planes of consciousness gradually. The problem is that you get freer and freer the further you go out on these planes, the more aware you are. And the questions of what is you and what is somebody else and what is the environment kind of dissolve. The other problem is classically, if you look at people who like to astral project, they like to go and hang out on the astral plane. The problem is you have a tremendous amount of energy as an incarnate being. And as soon as you arrive there, the environment rearranges itself according to your expectations, sort of like synchronicity itself. So no matter what it is that you would like to try to find out, you're going to wind up in environments that reflect what your expectations are. And, that's the reason people get lost out there, because they find what they're looking for because they literally create what they're looking for. And seeing the overall patterns, like, for instance, in Theosophy, they talk about souls existing on different, basic energy rays and being oriented to different patterns of vibration in groups and clusters. The problem is, as a human being, your view of the universe is so small. And since that we are innately subject to being self-delusional, to believing what we think and creating things that look like what we think, actually determining what these wider, greater cosmic realities are really like is extremely iffy and very difficult. And I'm very concerned that people run around basically lost in delusions of, what they think it is in this house of mirrors. When, in fact, I think the Buddha was absolutely correct when he said that, these things kind of take care of themselves, and that what's really important is sort of the compassion that we show each other. That, if we live our lives as genuine, compassionate people towards each other, these wider metaphysical issues are going to sort of take care of themselves automatically.
Okay, thanks. That's food for thought.
Thank you. Dr. Surprise, do you have any closing remarks or perhaps some things that you think are important to mention here that we didn't discuss this evening?
On the light side, I think the most important thing is everybody run out and buy 5 copies of my book as soon as possible.
Great idea.
In reality, if you understand that synchronistic events are mirrors of what you're thinking and feeling, that's the only basic information you really need. That you have this ability, that it's normal. Everybody does it. In fact, there's a considerable amount of evidence that any mammal can do it. That's innate to what it is to be alive. I would like to encourage people for understanding they have a choice about creating these patterns and interpreting what they mean. And it's my sincere hope that that the book itself will sort of take some people who are lost in the House of Mirrors out of the House of Mirrors and realize that instead of being sort of confused and concerned, you can be sort of amazed and amused.
Fantastic. Thank you. And will you remind our listening audience where they can purchase your book one more time, please?
Sure. The book is on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, many independent booksellers around the world. It's available in electronic versions on Nook and on Kindle. And there's a website, howsynchronicityworks.com. Much of it is an ad for the book, but it's also some forums. I'd love to hear people who have their own stories about synchronicity. And if you want to leave me messages on that website, I try to get back and answer everybody that writes in.
Thank you. And I encourage our audience to purchase your book. I read it. It's a very good read. And also to visit your website, howsynchronicityworks.com. On behalf of Fox and Time Monk Radio, we thank you for joining us this evening, Dr. Surprise. Your research and experiences are invaluable in helping us understand synchronistic events and how we mirror them in our own lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would you guys do me a favor? I was rather shocked to find out I was talking to a panel of well-educated and thought-out people from many parts of the world. Who are you folks?
Oh, gosh.
We're just a
That's a good
ragtag bunch
question.
of people who happen to join up together.
All volunteers and all inquiring people that want to find their way and be empowered and think for themselves and do all the things you recommend. And we're trying our best to do that.
Yeah, we couldn't do it without everybody that contributes here. We really enjoy what we do, I think.
Yeah, the quality of the questions is quite good.
Yeah, thank you. We have a very intelligent group of people that have assembled.
Indeed, I've done, about 45 of these now, and yours is amongst the best. I've done.
Well, I will say, Dr. Surprise, we do try and formulate questions that will allow the guest to bring out the best of their work. This is about showcasing who we're interviewing, because we will then learn that much more from who we're interviewing.
And much goes into the production part of it as well. I mean, the questions are really vetted and looked over before it even gets to the interview.
Yes, and they were very pertinent. I mean, you picked out. There are some questions that come up repeatedly because they're the most important points, and you hit them all.
Great.
Good.
Glad to hear that.
Thank you for your feedback.
Yeah, good.
It's nice to hear.
It's greatly appreciated for sure.
Mm.
So I'm going to let you
Yes.
guys go,
Okay, well,
unless you need
been-
any information or anything.
Yeah, thanks for sticking around and just having a little informal chat with us. It was nice.
yeah.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you much.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
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 That was nice.
That was very nice.
Very, very nice.
Very